Immaterium Wars is a two-player game. Each player will choose a warband for defeating the enemy player on a post-apocalyptic sci-fi world. Your success is measured in victory points awarded by the main mission, side missions, and by each gang's own point-earning mechanics. In order to follow the guide you will need Draka and Joe warbands, a grid board, scenery pieces for coverage and vision obstruction walls similar to ours, 5 Immaterium dice, or also called ID, for each player's reserve, 5 extra ID for action rolls, 5 attack markers, 5 defense markers, and 5 special ability markers. Normal dices for minis wounds and for victory points recount. Finally, 5 scrap markers. Let's start. Please copy our movements and actions step by step for a better understanding of the game mechanics. It's not required that you roll any dice in this quick start guide. First, each player chooses a warband. Then, we roll a dice to decide the deploy setting and the main mission. For this guide, we will choose the corner deploy and the domination main mission. Secondary missions are optional and we haven't included them now. Before every round, each player rolls 5 ID to decide each own's reserve and who has the initiative. The player with initiative decides who starts playing first. In the first round, whoever starts the game first also deploy their figures on the board first. In this case, player A gets 2 critical, 1 attack, 1 movement and 1 miss. The player that rolls more critical gets the initiative. On a tier wins the player with more movement. If the tie remains, players roll a normal dice. Keep your reserve ID in your reserve area for future use. Player A decides to start himself and sets up first in corner A. To determine the deployment area, we will omit the central squares, as our board has odd rows and columns. A diagonal is drawn from the center of the shorter side to the center of the adjacent side. The squares crossed by the diagonal are also included in the deployment area. Player A then sets out his first figure, player B does the same, and so on until both players have set out all their figures. This is how the board looks after all figures have been deployed. Now it's turn for the reserve ability. By priority order, players decide if spending a reserve ID to gain a bonus for the round or not. Just a single ID can be spent. After that, if the band leader is still alive for a given player, spent dice can be rolled again to recover it. If the result is the same as the resource spent, or critical, the player recovers the ID and put it back to its reserve. Player A uses the movement ability on Draka and moves 3 squares. Player B uses a defense ability on its more exposed destroyer. This will add an extra defense ID for that figure during the round. Check the rulebook for more details about the reserve abilities. Before starting the round, take your time to check all figures' cards in play to have a minimum understanding about your warband and your enemies. Here's a card sample. You don't need to learn perfectly all this now. You will keep discovering it throughout the games. More details can be found in the rulebook. Now let's start the round. The game loop is quite simple. The player with priority starts activating his first figure and performing all its actions. Then the turn switches to player B, who will do the same, and so on until all figures have been activated by both players. Then the round ends. On its first activation, player A activates his shooter and performs its 2 actions. First one to move 3 squares and last one to perform a long-range attack to an enemy destroyer. He rolls 2 ID and gets a miss and a movement. The attack fails, so the destroyer receives no damage. The turn switches to player B, who activates his destroyer. First action for movement. Second action for attacking the enemy shooter that receives normal damage. Last action for attacking again and gets a miss. We use a normal dice near the shooter to count the wounds. Now it's turn for player A, again. He activates the other shooter and performs its two actions. First one to move and second one to attack the enemy destroyer. He rolls 2 ID and gets critical and damage, so the final attack is critical and he receives 3 damage, that we count with a normal dice. Now turn switches to player B, who activates the other destroyer. First action to move. Second action to attack the exposed enemy shooter. Since the shooter gets no coverage from nearby walls, barricades or figures, he has no defense ID to roll. The destroyer attacks and rolls normal damage. Then uses its third action to attack again and rolls critical damage. The enemy shooter accumulates 6 wounds and dies. We place a scrap marker in the defeated figure location and player B gets 1 victory point. As the attacking destroyer did critical damage, it activates the Armored 1 ability, which will give him an extra defense ID for the whole round. Now we switch back to player A, who activates his Scavenger Executor. First action to move and second action to do a coverage action, which grants him an extra ID in the next defense roll only during the current round. In order to perform a coverage action, the figure must be adjacent to a nearby wall or barricade. Also, the figure must be adjacent to a wall or barricade to get benefited from this ability. Now it's turn for player B, who activates Joe. First 2 actions to move and last action to attack the enemy executor. Joe rolls normal damage with ignore coverage ability. This means the executor cannot benefit from nearby coverage or by its coverage action from last turn. The executor receives normal damage. Turn for player A again, who activates the Carrion Prophet. First action to move. Second action to attack a destroyer. Unfortunately rolls 2 defense, so the attack fails. Player B has no more figures to activate, so player A keeps playing. Finally, player A activates Draka. First action to claim an adjacent scrap marker. Second action to attack a destroyer. Reserve dices can be spent also to help in combat rolls. This time player A decides to spend a critical ID from its reserve to ensure a critical attack on that destroyer. After that, rolls the attack and gets a critical, a normal damage and a miss. Additionally, player A can reroll a combat ID by using the improved weapon Draka ability. He rerolls the miss and gets a defense, so the attack doesn't change. The final attack is critical. Although the destroyer has a defense dice because of the defense ability marked on the green token, even if he gets a critical and blocks 1 incoming critical attack, Draka has 2 critical ID. Therefore it's impossible for the destroyer to block that attack. Draka deals 4 damage to the destroyer and moves 5 squares for free. On its last action, Draka attacks the destroyer again with a close combat attack. Player A decides to spend another critical ID from its reserve to ensure a critical attack on that destroyer again. After that, he rolls the attack and gets a critical, a support and a movement. The player rerolls the movement and gets a miss. The final attack is critical with piercing. The destroyer cannot block the attack and receives 5 damage. Therefore he accumulates 12 wounds and dies, and player A gets 1 victory point. We place a scrap marker in the defeated figure location plus an extra marker adjacent to the first one. The Draka Warband card explains how many markers are generated after defeating an enemy. The round is over. At the end of the round, unused figure tokens, such as coverage from the coverage action, Armored 1, or other special abilities, are removed from play, unless otherwise specified in that ability. Check the rulebook and the ability annex for more details. After that, round 2 would start by re-rolling your reserve again with your spent and unspent ID. Then, a player would earn the initiative, and optionally both players would decide by priority order if activating a reserve ability or not, and so on. As a reminder, special abilities such as Draka's Mayhem can be activated anytime, even during an opponent's figure activation, and only by spending ID from the reserve. On the other hand, arcane abilities count as actions and can be activated only during that figure activation. The rulebook explains the arcane ability casting mechanic in depth. The game ends at the end of round 5 or when a player has no remaining figures in the board. The player with more victory points win the game. If both players have the same number of victory points, the final result is a draw. We wish you enjoy the game as much as we do. Please share your questions in our Discord server and we will do our best to answer them all. Thank you for watching.